Hello Propenomix people, and welcome to the Sunday supplement from the 21st of April 2024, and this week's is called Relativity and Absolutism. So, as you'll know, I like to start with a quote, and this week's is "Variety is the spice of life that gives it all its flavour," and that's William Cowper, the poet. So before we crack on, 27th of April is the first day in a series of dates of a series of social housing events that Partners in Property are organising. There are 7 speaker slots in total, covering every aspect of social housing. Attendees will be able to walk away with all the nuts and bolts they need to decide whether you want to incorporate social housing within your own property portfolio. The agenda will include why Sue Sims started in social housing as an investor more than 8 years ago, Wayne Millwood, the founder of Room Match, outlining all the due diligence you need to undertake when deciding on which social housing provider to work with, Mark Turner, the Chief Operating Officer at the Housing Network, talking about the future of social housing, a social housing expert mortgage broker confirming exactly what you need to provide and take into account when you're looking for funding for social housing, and Pinder Singh Dhaliwal, who's the Managing Director at Falcon Insurance, giving you an overview of how to insure your property that is leased to a social housing provider. And they're available at the link on the Partners in Property website covering the social housing seminars. So, welcome to the supplement proper. Now we've heard from the sponsors. We got through another week as yields looked ever rising when we breached my high tide of 4.25% on the 5-year gilt in the middle of the week. It seems that the governor, in spite of my overall critiques of the man, may have for once done us a solid, but we'll get into that. It's always a meaty week when the labour market and inflation figures are both published, and we had a bit more of that. I also collated a fair amount of anecdotal evidence this week, and I'm going to have a word about that too. So alongside a deeper dive as we go into both unemployment and inflation, we've also got to look at the retail sales so we can get some kind of handle on consumption, and then round off with a more fulsome look at the 5-year bond and swaps. The good old-fashioned layabouts that the British public just love being told that they are got a rollicking this week from soon-to-be former Prime Minister Mr Sunak, the weak leader, as he will be known, but perhaps with the IBAN cigarettes legacy, which is a fascinating debate all on its own. It struck me as a rallying cry to the voters that the Tories are losing to reform, or think that they are. Analysis of the reform voters shows as many are coming from elsewhere as they are from the right-hand side of the equation, and a decision to go right back up to 8% or so of the vote when you're so far behind looks like another poor one, to be honest. Let's face it, elections are won in the centre. But is that really what he said, though, or just what the media portrayed him as saying? And then you could argue which one of those matters anyway, but we'll take a look at that. It also ups the chances of Liz Truss being the next leader of the party, still polling very badly though amongst all voters, but her thick skin gives her no worries. There's also a semi-defence of her, which is more of a critique of the Bank of England, and a good one, to be honest, defiantly led by Robert Peston and Steph McGovern. Mostly Peston doing the defending, although it is almost a second-order consequence, on the excellent The Rest is Money podcast, which is in 3 parts. Who Killed Liz Truss, the mini-series is called. So, after our lettuce amuse-bouche, back to the starters. Are we just a nation of lazy good-for-nothings? Or has a pandemic and a gigantic waiting list on the back of said pandemic and industrial action, alongside other things, caused a lot more sickness in the UK? Or, as usual, is there some way to meet between those two polar opposites that aren't necessarily mutually exclusive? Let's get into the labour market overview for answers to that. We get figures about 6 weeks or so late, but then get a snapshot of the more recent month as well. February wasn't incredible, 18,000 payrolled employees fewer at the end of the month than at the beginning, but 352,000 more on payrolls than a year before. March's early data was more worrying, 67,000 fewer employees on payrolls and only 204,000 more than 12 months before. That looks like a pretty bloody month, really. 67k is a big loss. Employment now sits at 74.5% of the eligible workforce. That's 1.7% down on where it was pre-pandemic. Inactivity now sits at 22.2, 1.7% up from where it was pre-pandemic. Is that the end of the analysis then? Not quite yet. I wasn't as bearish as many of the headlines were because mostly the ONS, by their own admission, don't think much of their quarterly figures these days. We have a new measure coming in September, likely not to be worth the wait, to be honest, but we do already have real-time PAYE information and also claimant counts, which can be trusted to an extent. We also lost 106,000 working days to disputes in February 2024. We lost none for 2 years. Well, I'm sure we did, but there are none on record. Between January 2020 and January 2022. In December 2022, we lost 830,000. But in September 1979, we lost 11.716 million hours of work. If that helps to put all of this into context. Now, that was the winter of discontent, of course, or the start of it. So, pay growth also features in the labour market overview and was 6% excluding bonus. That's down from 6.1, but not down fast enough. 6 still looks very big, and just imagine what April's number will look like when released in a couple of months' time, after the minimum wage rises this year. I estimate around 18% of the workforce are pegged to or at minimum wage, so that perhaps puts 1.8% or so on top of that figure. In real terms, after CPIH, as the ONS prefers it, that was a 1.9% annualised increase in real terms. Very healthy indeed, and would be great if the underlying economy generating that was also healthy, rather than coughing and spluttering. And vacancies fell again 21 periods in a row, but to 916,000, still 120,000 more than the pandemic, although the labour pool has grown by far more than that in the same period. Same old story for now on this one. So with 853,000 more people economically inactive since Feb 2020, the long-term sick number is around 350,000 more since then. Less than 5% of the waiting list, which might tell you something about the average age of those on the waiting list, of course, but still a big number that needs reversing and fixing. Let's give Rishi a chance and analyse what he actually said about benefits and the like, in stats, which he loves, of course. Personal independence payments are to be reviewed. There's a massive rise in PIP for anxiety and depression. Current projections are PIP to go up by 52% to reach 32.8 billion by 2027-28, and that is a scary rate of growth. Total benefit spending for people of working age with a disability or health condition is up nearly 2/3 to 69 billion. That's more than the core schools budget or more than we spend on policing. The promise is a focus on getting back to work. The evidence shows that those in work tend to lead happier and healthier lives, although I'd like to see those stats ring-fenced for the disabled or those with health conditions so we can make a proper comparison. There is a promise to end benefits after 12 months if people haven't accepted a job or don't meet conditions as set by their work coach. 250,000 have been out of work for 12 months or more. 424,000 fewer people will be assessed as not needing to prepare for work by 2028-29. There will be fallout, as there has been in the past. Will that be a hard price that is difficult but worth paying? 180,000 more people will be moved into the intensive work search group. There's also going to be more digital support to detect fraud, which should save 600 million by 2028-29 apparently. Reading the whole speech, it looks like typical political economics. Tough choices. You can read it as, too many have learned how to play this current system, so we need to change it. Or you can just look at the stats at face value. There are some gigantic increases in certain benefits that are being used in a different way from how they were designed. That would suggest that reform is a good idea. The other way of looking at it is a fix for the leaky boat before the other. A more sympathetic party gets into power. Anyway, enough on Labour and Labour. Inflation. CPIH, the ONS's preferred figure, is still 3.8%, unchanged from Feb, and plus 0.6% month on month. 12 months ago, it was 0.7% month on month. CPI, the bank benchmark, and the one that makes all the headlines, 3.2, versus a consensus of 3.1, but a February print of 3.4. So falling, but not as fast as forecasted, and not as fast as expected or hoped. 0.6% month on month versus 0.8 month on month 12 months ago, when we were still at double-digit inflation. Core CPIH is still 4.7 from 4.8 in Feb. CPIH annual services rate, still 6%. Services inflation overall is still 6%. Core CPI 4.2, forecast 4.1. Month-on-month core was 0.6, still outside of where it needs to be, but the last 6 months only prints 1.8 still, if annualised. Although if you took out January's minus 0.9 for a single month, that would change that quite a bit. Of what contributed to CPIH the most, housing and household services is always worth a mention, up 0.4% month on month. Recreation and culture has been making a comeback as the cost of living crisis has eased and was up 0.9 month on month. Restaurants and hotels were up 1.1 month on month, perhaps preparing for the minimum wage rise a little early, or perhaps just because there's more holidaying to be done in March than February simply because of the weather. So to draw that together, I feel there will be few surprises. It isn't over yet by a chalk. Services inflation 6, wages 6. Wages figures to go up, not down over the next couple of months. Perhaps services too. That takes us to mid-June without the conditions to lower interest rates if you're a member of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee. Just keep fighting the good fight and swimming through the treacle. Retail sales then. Flat month on month, up a tiny amount year on year, 0.8 just about positive, but with no adjustment for inflation. The hope was a bit better than that because of Easter, so there'll be some disappointments there. The bonds and swaps now. Gilts, we opened the week at 4.08 on the 5-year, still above where I think we should be, but who falls out about 10 basis points or so? We ended in the safe haven of 4.13. Swaps, after Thursday's close, 4.165 was the print, and the swap rate was 4.131, so there's still more supply than demand. I'm just miserable when it starts with a 4, frankly. The escalating Middle East has not helped. Iran launched their first ever direct attack on Israel. It does appear to be posturing and de-escalation from a distance, but no risk can be allowed to pervade, hopefully. Oil is wobbly, and I shared a solid piece from the FT from the legendary Mohammed El-Erian on Friday, which was a very powerful analogy, hopefully likely one you've heard before. And the link to that is in the article on the Partners in Property website and on my LinkedIn. So just one more roundup before we get to the end of the macro. The Bank of England had several appearances this week, and I thought it a good idea to summarise them briefly. Most of the speakers were on the more hawkish side, so it's no surprise that bond yields have gone up. The Governor first, Andrew Bailey, basically said the most obvious thing that all already knew. Inflation will go down for the next print in April. He used it to suggest we might cut before the US, but I think the US cut will be much more politically charged than the UK cut when it comes. So it's a dangerous game, and it also weakens the currency, of course, when he puts out chat like that. I do think, though, as I've developed this view with some evidence over the past few weeks, that the US has more of an entrenched secular inflation problem than the UK. However, the UK system feels a lot more built on sand at the moment. We can't afford 6% rises in wages and services with a limp economy. It has to force some efficiencies, which will raise productivity, but also that raises the benefits bill massively. And indeed, perhaps Sunak knows that, and that's why he's already taking the knife out in that department, and it's just good economic stewardship with inevitable fallout. Next, Sarah Breeden, the Deputy Governor for Financial Stability, spent time talking about tokenisation and stability in the crypto world. There will be two sides to this. Those who roll their eyes and say, of course the central bank wants control and oversight over all tokens, but we cannot allow a libertarian attitude to enable criminals who are still overwhelmingly interested in cryptocurrency when so much progress has finally been made in anti-money laundering over the past 15 years or so. It's not an easy one. Dave Ramsden, Deputy Governor for Markets and Banking, talked in Washington about his take on what has caused the UK's inflation. He referred to Ben Bernanke's report on the bank and its forecasting, which I'll cover in a coming week. He reminded us that forecasting inflation is hard. I agree, but I think it's woeful in terms of some of the rhetoric that's come out of the bank in the past 3.5 years. He said that it looks like the UK is not much of an outlier, although the 2024 wage and price growth performance still looks on the very highest end of the G7 nations to me, and US wage growth has been far more under control than UK wage growth for a fair bit longer now. He went through the usual stuff. It would be hard not to. Ukraine and energy prices. He also talked about the decision to hold at 5.25, but not in any detail. He talked about services inflation, highlighting 6.9% as recently as September 23. But he didn't point out that March 24's number is still 6%, a pace of drop that is just far too slow to get to this scenario where we hit target and stay there generally. I'm stuck scratching my head, but we're at a time when the bank's economic models should be vastly superior to a one-man gang such as myself. Let's see. The bank has got 2.2% inflation penciled in for Q2 2024. So they see a much slower dead cat bounce. I can see how we can get 2.2 for April and perhaps even lower, but I don't see how inflation in services doesn't continue to rise at 5.xx%, which in a month where prices aren't actively falling in energy, like May and June, and with oil elevated and who knows what happening, CPI being compromised to 47% of services inflation starts off at 0.47 times 5.5, even if services inflation dropped that much in the face of massive minimum wage rises. Well, that's 2.6% before we start on the other 53% component of CPI. It just can't be right, in my view. They see inflation averaging 3% in Q1 of 2025, so a bit more than a dead cat bounce. I'm absolutely higher than their 2.2 for Q2 24, but see the 3% as possible, although at the lower end of my range. Perhaps core inflation is still over 4%, remember, and core CPIH is over 4.5%. The energy price cap stuff doesn't change core at all, so a big drop can only be in relative performance, which I've highlighted in this month's report. There is a big dropout of 1.3% for April 2023 in the core month-on-month to drop out next month, which helps massively, but that still sees core in the threes, of course. So the tightening of the labour market is the thing that ultimately will help with wage growth, alongside lowering inflation expectations. And the timing of all of that might be a really positive thing. Let's see. Most companies are still expecting to be handing out circa 5% pay rises for 2024 as a rule, which ultimately is only half of the increase in the minimum. Luckily for employers, most people don't think in percentages, is all I can say. It was a useful and interesting speech from Ramsden, in spite of how many holes I want to pick in it. Then we moved on to Haskell, an external member of the committee, usually hawkish. He was instead speaking about AI, where he dropped the least surprising news ever. We're behind the US. We are completely underpowered compared to them, of course, when it comes to tech companies in general. So there's just no news here, surely. Nothing he said really moved the needle at all in the markets. And Megan Green was the last one to raise her head above the parapet this week. My favourite, I make no bones about saying. She did have an impact, suggesting that she's hesitant to start voting to cut rates. She preferred an analogy to a bumpy last mile, the notoriously difficult problem to solve for online retailers, as far as inflation goes, and said that the slowdown in globalisation was also a factor. You'd certainly expect yields to have hardened a little on the back of her chat on Tuesday. So anyway, that's the macro. For those watching the video version of this on YouTube, you might have noticed that I've been joined by Imogen. Imogen, wave, please. Thank you. Right, for the meat this week, I wanted to have a look at the Spring Market Insight Report from Hamptons International, because they cover a few different angles and also use their proprietary data in the same way that Zoopla do to create reports of interest. So into the breach we go. The report, for a start, contains one of the better graphs for indicating comparative health of the market over recent years that I think I've seen. Any estate agents listening will be able to add value, because I'm not sure if the way that houses are marketed has particularly changed in that interim period. I mean, the pervasion of the modern method of auction would have had a small impact on this metric, I would have thought, but not by a huge amount. This is the proportion of homes sold above asking price, ranging from around 10% in 2010 in England and Wales to 39% in 2021-22, and back down to a surprisingly high 24% now. London was well ahead of that curve in the early 2010s, peaking in 2014, which won't surprise anyone, but staying ahead of the national graph until 2016-17 as that market started to cool. And London has just for the first time gone ahead of that curve again in 2024 year to date. Hamptons claim that the January and February pace almost always sets the tone for the year ahead. It makes sense, but they haven't provided data to support that claim. Prospective buyers up 14% from 2023, tracking only slightly below 2022 levels, although it's fair to say 2022 was pretty much a year of two halves. Or, the market didn't really start to fall off until August, meaning the last 4 months of the trading year were tough. The report is slightly outdated now, just upon publication, the risk of writing anything down post-pandemic. Pricing in the June rate cuts, which the bond market now thinks are unlikely to happen until September or so. They talked about 3 rate cuts, which are now more likely to be 1 or 2. Therefore, the particularly recent rise in yields, we're now trading nearly 1% higher than the Christmas lows of 2023, is not really written into this report and will make a negative difference to the buoyancy of the market over the coming months. 8% of properties are going under offer within a week of being offered for sale, compared to 6% last year. Fewer homes are being reduced. Hamptons also talks of choice still being more limited than pre-COVID, although the Christopher Watkins stats for listings dictate that prices have moved forward, and that post-Easter week was the best week for sales agreed since May 2023, and that we're 10% above historical 8-year average to date in terms of listings. So I'm not sure if Hamptons specifically are struggling a bit, or their geographical bias down south is just leading to a tougher market than nationwide. Volume looks good on Chris's stats though, with 350,000 gross sales year to date. Remember, at the moment around 1 in 5 are falling through, so that needs to be taken into account. Net sales are 4% of the average from 2017 to 19 and 13% ahead of the 2023 comparable figure. So that's a pretty good yardstick for the health of the market nationwide from all the data. Back to London, Hamptons see fewer homes available but 23% more buyers looking to move than last year and 10% more deals done in February than the comparable month in 2019. Hamptons talk of potential price growth in 2024 in the face of the first couple of months' worth of data that went into this report from the Nationwide and the Halifax. The report also contains a nice summary of the Competitions and Market Authorities, the CMA, report into the factors holding back house building in Britain. A report on a report. Lush. There are 4 principles of a future scheme to help first-time buyers. Number 1, a scheme should incorporate supply-led reforms to weaken its potential to push up house prices. Number 2, new demand reduces the incentive for house builders to cut prices. Therefore, any scheme should only try to attract those who would not otherwise be able to buy. Number 3, reducing deposit requirements leaves buyers vulnerable to higher mortgage rates and falling prices, increasing the risk of negative equity. And number 4, any temporary scheme creates winners and losers and potentially makes it harder for others to buy. Now, I don't know about you, but this does not to me sound like a report packed with great solutions. It sounds like significant problems without one single proposed solution. All it really does is help to expose Help to Buy for what it was, a transfer directly into the pockets of large house builders and something that was kept the price of often substandard new build products artificially high. Nothing also doesn't work because the house builders know how to manage that. They choke off the stock temporarily and keep the price artificially high, which is what they did in 2023. The big conclusion is that some sort of income cap on any scheme is what is needed. That doesn't sound like something that will sort out the supply side, of course, but something for key workers would make sense if the government had any interest in building relationships with key workers, which it seems fairly obvious that they don't at this time. The conclusion, after exploring the positives of an open-ended scheme from Hamptons, is that the government is likely further away than ever on its 2019 manifesto target of delivering 300,000 homes each year. Next up, what's cheaper, renting or buying? I always criticise these sorts of comparisons because the most basic ones compare mortgage payments to rent payments. Indeed, last week the Resolution Foundation report tried to compare rental payments to the interest component on mortgage payments. Laughable, frankly, because you need to pay the capital regardless of where it's going. You forego investment returns from elsewhere on the deposit. You also take on maintenance, compliance, if you choose to do it since you've got the choice in your own home, buildings insurance and improvement costs. You've also got all the frictional costs to consider, of course. Nevertheless, after some stretches recently where renting has been cheaper than buying, the Hamptons data indicates that its buying is £136 per month cheaper than renting. This is compared to £400 per month plus cheaper when interest rates were much lower. Hamptons also ascribed the percentage of the market that first-time buyers are making up at the moment to the bid to escape rising rents. That makes some sense, of course. I'd also expect there's some pent-up demand as they sat last year waiting for prices to crash, whilst idiotic forecasters were spreading their insane forecasts. Flat prices are going up faster than the smaller homes in 36% of local authorities, which bucks a trend. This number was nearly zero throughout 2022. The costs on a monthly basis, however, are bludgeoned somewhat by larger deposits if you can get them, and the average FTB last year put down a 25% deposit compared to 23% in 2019. In London, that's typically 33%, but also typically of a much higher price in the first place, of course. There's also a fantastic map of England and Wales showing some income multiples required in local incomes, so the multiple of local average income required to buy a house. And there's some real disparity, but this shows how much tighter or not it is, and how much harder it is to buy in certain areas based on average incomes in that area. Really illuminating. It could be average first-time buyer income rather than average income if you wanted to make it even more accurate and illuminating if that data is available. But still, it's not bad. If you want to see that, you can have a look on the Partners in Property website or follow the link on my LinkedIn profile for my newsletter. On to the rental market then, and the overall picture painted by Hamptons is that rental growth is cooling. We know this. They put some colour around it though. They're talking about new rents, remember, although they don't make that clear, because ONS figures are showing faster growth than ever before, as existing rents seek to catch up with new rents. 12% in August 2023 was the peak, according to them, down to 7.1% by February this year. Similar to the inflationary cycle in general, but lagging, which is very commonplace with rents. London had rents rising at 17.1% in that August, according to Hamptons, and that's now down to 6.1%. Very similar rate to wages and services growth, actually, interestingly. 61% of new lets are getting a higher rent in 2024 compared to 81% in 22 and 80% in 23. Between 2015 and 2019, 49% of properties were getting a higher rent on relet. Rents on smaller homes are going up faster as demand for smaller properties has rocketed as people have downsized to cope with the increase in the cost of living. Affordability is cited as the thing causing the ceiling, which makes sense with Hamptons' portfolio largely concentrated where it is. First-time buyers, they say, are now outnumbering investors 3 to 1. I'd love to see the logic behind this, because if FTBs are 33% of all buyers, that puts investors at 11%, even though only 7% of debt issued at the moment is to investors. Perhaps that encapsulates the number of investors that solely use cash, however. That is possible. Stock is still down 41% in terms of availability compared to 2019. And again, as so often, no allowance is made for the fact that more rental properties are needed than 2019 because of significant population expansion, particularly in the demographic that tends to rent. They see rental inflation ahead of general inflation for 2024, which is as easy a prediction as Sunak's halving of inflation. The equivalent of the old trick in dieting when you pile in 10,000 calories a day before going on a diet. A guaranteed success, which isn't a success at all, of course, it's just tricking the measurement system. They also have a focus point in the report on homes selling off-market. We've played around 10% over the recent years, which is fairly high as a rule. That looks to be down to about 7%, so if you know a struggling property trader, that's likely why. However, £1 million plus homes are at an all-time high, with an unbelievable 33%, that's 1 in 3 £1 million plus homes, selling off-market. In 2023, 51% of £2 million plus homes change hands off-market. It's close to the norm now. It's a very clever way for a vendor to test the market, of course, without being plastered all over the internet. I also think it provides the illusion of a bargain, whereas most things I ever get shown that are off-market but not coming through a trader are ridiculously overpriced, of course. It also, as the report identifies, might just be because the market was weak, and once it's stronger, it will be deemed that the best way to go is on the market and attracted the widest possible number of buyers. 30% of owners of £1 million plus homes went on the market after an average of 62 days off-market advertising. Also, it's starting to become more of a tactic for those that were on the market and then have a deal fall through. It will remain a watching brief of interest to me. I hope you found that report as interesting as I did. A lot we knew, with some potentially regional bias in there, but some really interesting facts and figures and surprising proportions in many ways for certain parts of the market. It's clear that the rental market is growing at an unstoppable rate for the moment, and that the buyer to investor ratio is likely to climb a little bit more if rates did continue to rise from here. Although we're really at the top of my range, it's just bearishness keeping those bond prices down now. And there's bound to be positivity next month when we get an inflation print that starts with a 2 on CPI, even with all of my warnings about what's going to happen and that it should be more than a dead cat bounce. There's only one way to deal with all of this, of course. Keep calm, always listen to the supplement, and carry on. Thank you.